Hello, everyone. I started going down this rabbit hole of understanding more about John Brown through watching The Good Lord Bird that is on Showtime. I studied John Brown before I eventually read the novel The Good Lord Bird by McBride. The story of John Brown is fascinating and it leaves you to ask, what why did I not know about him sooner? There were there are a few things to take note of while we consider who is this man. John Brown is most famous because of his affiliation with leading the charge for Bleeding Kansas, which led to Kansas being a free state. The book, The Zealot and the Emancipator by H.W. Brands, describes the interrelationship between John Brown and Abraham Lincoln. There are many links between them. First, Abraham Lincoln was aware of John Brown. Abraham Lincoln was afraid that John Brown would move the Republican Party too far to the left, which would make his ability to win the presidency impossible. Lincoln was never interested in emancipating the slaves, as he was a president for his constituents, which were white men. He would do anything to save the Union. This would mean that there was a level of compromise that would take place between the border states, which would hold slaves, and the northern states in order to beat the South. Uh, what is fascinating is Mr. Booth, the assassinator of Lincoln, was not only at Lincoln's inauguration, but he was also at John Brown's execution. Now, the history of John Brown and his family was even more fascinating. His father sat on the board of Oberlin College, which is the first college that not only allowed free blacks and runaway slaves to attend college. Oberlin College was located in Ohio, and many talk about the Mississippi River and the Ohio River throughout slavery. But we need to pause and investigate the Underground Railroad records by William Steele and Sweet Taste of Liberty, a true story of slavery and restitution in America by W. Caleb McDaniel, in which they go into detail about the city of Cleveland. The city was a stronghold for abolitionists in which they would fight to protect blacks who were born free or escaped slavery from being taken into or being taken back into slavery. With the city feeling this way, then it makes sense that Oberlin College would feel safe, in which they were no former enslaved people who were ever lost back into slavery or recaptured by the federal government. John Brown did in fact seek counsel from people like Frederick Douglass in regards to planning the insurrection. Frederick Douglass was infamous in stating that John Brown was willing to die for the slave, whereas Frederick Douglass was willing to live for the slave. John Brown implicated no one and wanted all to go free, as he would die alone for the cause. Yet the federal government came to arrest Frederick Douglass, but Frederick Douglass escaped to Canada, and the John Brown documents that were in his desk, in which could implicate him, were removed. Abraham Lincoln and other abolitionists like William Garrison actually believed and funded the removal of blacks to Liberia, which is the American settlement for formerly enslaved blacks. Very few blacks left, and in fact, this was a racist policy. They thought the thought was that blacks should be free from slavery because that because it was a moral ill, but they should not be integrated into America's society because whites would never treat them fairly or equally. It would be better for the country to remove them. John Brown stands out because his father and himself and his children believed in full integration and freedom of blacks. John Brown's Abolitionist by David Reynolds even publishes a picture of John Brown in 1846 that was taken by a black man, Augustus Washington of Hartford, Connecticut. Also, abolitionists who were found guilty were branded with an SS on their hand. This was later called Salvation to the Slave, and it was written about in The Branded Hand, a poem by John Greenleaf Whittier in 1846. Brown had a goal of building a multicultural society in which blacks and other minorities would be fully literate and incorporated with whites. In fact, he created a constitution that was not aimed to overthrow the US government, but it was to include everyone within government. He writes, whereas slavery throughout its entire existence in the United States is none other than the most barbarous, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of one part of its citizens upon another portion, the only conditions of which are perpetually imprisonment and hopeless servitude, are absolute extermination and utter disregard and violation of those eternal and self evident truths set forth in our Declaration of Independence. Therefore, we, the citizens of the United States and the oppressed people, who by a recent decision of the Supreme Court are declared to have no rights, which the white man is bound to respect, together with all of the people degraded by the laws thereof, do for the time being ordained and established ourselves the following provisional constitution and ordinances, the better to protect our persons, property, lives, and liberties, and to govern our actions. Brown selected Harper's Ferry because it was the place that the United States arsenal had in Virginia. There were slaves on federal property. Thus, he can demonstrate the hypocrisy of the federal law of not having slaves in the North. He was funded by whites and blacks in the North. One such funder was Mary Ellen Pleasant. Her name should be known to us all. She was a woman who was from Massachusetts, and she migrated to California. She created a fortune in California through mining silver and operating boarding houses for the rich in San Francisco. When John Brown was captured, she did go into hiding. John Brown did ask Frederick Douglass to fight, and he selected not to do so, in which W.B. Du Bois felt that is one reason why um, blacks did not join in high of a number. Douglass thought slave owners could still be negotiated to end slavery, yet when John Brown talked to Harriet Tubman, he not only called her General Tubman, but he also recruited other blacks for her. Her plan was to be there and fight along with John Brown. However, she became sick and could not make it. His actions on Harper's Ferry to take arsenal from the federal government in order to arm enslaved people, um, in order to partner with them to fight in fighting for their freedom, was unsuccessful. Yet it ignited the South to start arming themselves before the Civil War. Also, the transatlantic slave route started once again after the South broke away from the North. John Brown was sentenced to death, and two others were also sentenced to death. Yet, John Brown really wanted to be the only person um, to be held accountable for this. He implicated no one. Blacks around the country held ceremonies for him the very moment he was executed. Black women took collections to send to his wife, Mary Brown, because Black women felt Mary would be most harmed. Emerson and Thoreau strived to keep his legacy alive through writing about Brown being heroic, etc. Emerson went further and argued for Blacks to not only be free, but to have voting rights. John Brown's legacy is not just being accurate that a civil war was inevitable, but he also was progressive about having a true equitable society, creating a compound in upstate New York, not far from where Harriet Tubman lived, and now is currently buried, in which free Blacks lived and traded with each other as equals. Throughout history, Blacks have held John Brown in high esteem, with Malcolm X saying that the only white person he would trust would be one who has the mindset and determination of John Brown. In 1909, W.E.B. Du Bois, a man who went to Fisk University, then to Harvard University, who was a Pan Africanist and left America to become a citizen of Ghana, published a book, John Brown, under the idea that this book is at once a record of and a tribute to the man who, of all Americans, has perhaps come nearest to touching the real souls of Black folks. W.B. Du Bois describes John Brown as a man who touched their former enslaved people in America, warm, loving hearts, but not their hard heads. The Canadian Negroes, for instance, were men who knew what slavery meant. They had suffered into degradation, to its repression, and its still more fatal license. They knew the slave system. They had been slaves. They had risked life to help loved ones to escape its far reaching tentacles. They had reached a land of freedom and had begun to taste the joy of being human. Du Bois further asserts how free slaves within the North were equally responsible for upholding slaves as those in the South. John Brown put a fire in the Southerners' heart and put a fire in the Northerners' conscience. John Brown's last words before he was hung after being found guilty of treason and other crimes at Harper's Ferry. My love to all who love their neighbors. I have asked to be spared from having any weak or hypocritical prayers made over me when I am publicly murdered, and that my only religious attendants be little, dirty, ragged, bareheaded, and barefooted slave boys and girls led by some gray headed slave mother. Farewell, farewell. John Brown's legacy is the first who was willing to live and die for a truly integrated society. He also was a very Christian man, in which he refused to join in the Christian faith of slaveholders. As John Brown stated, I will thank you to leave me alone. Your prayers would be an abomination to God. To another, he said, I would not insult God by bowing down in prayer with anyone who had the blood of the slave on his skirts. W.B. Du Bois predicted the browning of the nation that would be in direct contradiction to racism and oppression. Thus, Du Bois stated that the cost of liberty is less than the price of repression. The price of repressing the world's darker races is shown in the moral retrogression and in economic ways unparalleled since the age of the African slave trade. The cost would be something in pride and prejudice, for eventually many white men would be blacking black men's boots. But this cost we may ignore. Its greatest cost would be the new problems of racial intercourse and intermarriage, which would come to the front. Freedom and equal opportunity in this respect would inevitably bring some intermarriage of whites and yellows and browns and blacks. The cost is through blood. There is a freedom of development and equality of opportunity in the demand of Darwinism, and this calls for the abolition of hard and fast lines between races, just as it called for the breaking down of barriers between classes.